The club is pleased tonight. The club is pleased to have tonight's planned event with Georgia State University's Center for Ethics and Corporate Responsibility. I'd like to welcome the Center's director and moderator, Dr. John Knapp. John was a member of the Press Club board in the early 80s while he was working as a newspaper reporter and editor. He later served as president of a corporate communications consulting firm. And for the last 15 years, he has directed the Center for Ethics and Corporate Responsibility, an organization he founded as an educational resource for practitioners in business and the professions. So please welcome John Knapp.
Well, good evening, and I am very happy to add my welcome on behalf of Georgia State University's Robinson College of Business and the Center for Ethics and Corporate Responsibility. We're glad that all of you have taken time to join us this evening for this discussion. And I would add to that, to join in this discussion, because we're going to have some conversation with our panel on a topic that obviously is of enough interest to you to come this evening. And we want to invite you to be a part of that conversation as we move along. So there will come a point this evening where we turn the conversation to you and invite you to join us with your comments and your questions and the experiences and perspectives that you bring to the topic as well. And let me add my thanks to Assurant and to Jim Sykes and his group for sponsoring this evening's program. It's the sponsorship of supporting organizations like Assurant that make it possible for us to do these kinds of programs year-round as a service to the community. Scott mentioned that I was a member of the Press Club board in the past, and I can tell you that 25 years ago, that lineup of programs that he was mentioning, and in fact the lineup of Press Club programs that I see on email on a regular basis, doesn't sound at all like the Press Club that I was involved with as a board member 25 years ago. Our programs were more like what happened in the last hour, and they sort of continued like that. You know, we'd get together once a month, and we'd call it a Press Club meeting, and we would drink heavily down at Harrison's on Peachtree. So I'm glad to see that the Press Club is doing more thoughtful work than we were doing years ago. It's my pleasure to introduce to you the panel this evening. We have a great lineup of folks that bring perspectives to this question from a variety of viewpoints. And I'm pleased to introduce Leah Donosky. Leah's at the far end of the table there. She oversees website blogs and commenting policy at the AJC at ajc.com. She's played a number of roles at the AJC, and she's written for Newsweek and the Chicago Tribune. And significantly for this evening's discussion, she has worked with the Poynter Institute to develop guidelines for online journalism. Seated next to her is Jeremy Garlington. Jeremy's a leadership consultant and coach. His firm is called Point of View, LLC, and he's here this evening because he also publishes a blog called The Garlington Report. His blog covers CEO turnover and leadership issues, and in fact, Jeremy's blog actually broke the news that Delta Airlines was about to name Richard Anderson as its new CEO several months ago, and his blog was cited as the source of this news in subsequent coverage by the traditional news media nationally. Greg Lisby is a professor of communication at Georgia State University. He brings particular expertise in law and ethics in communication. He's a practicing attorney, and he serves on the editorial boards of several important journals in communication and journalism. And finally, David Rubinger. David directs global external communications for Equifax, the credit reporting company based here in Atlanta. David's responsibilities include oversight of media relations, product marketing, issues management, and communications with investors and the public. Earlier, he was head of media relations with the Ketchum Public Relations firm for 5 years, and when I first met David, he was editor of the Atlanta Business Chronicle. Well, an hour is hardly enough time to even begin a conversation about the growing influence of the blogosphere in global society. So this evening we're going to do our best to focus the conversation a bit, and we'll try to do that around 3 general questions. And as I say, these are questions to begin a conversation. No doubt you've got better questions of your own. But our questions are these. How are these these new media redefining journalism, both as tools of traditional media and as alternative sources of information for the public? Second, how and to what degree do bloggers influence business policies and practices? And what are the implications of this new business environment for business organizations? And then finally, given the freewheeling nature of the blogosphere, where many people are fond of saying there are no rules, I think it's reasonable to ask the question, what ethical standard applies in the blogosphere? Might we expect those who write and publish information in the blogosphere to adhere to what we've heretofore thought of as traditional journalistic standards, or might some other standard, if any at all, guide the work of those who practice as what's come to be known as citizen journalists in some circles? Well, before we begin the discussion, I'd like to set the stage by putting our questions in some context of what we think we know about the blogosphere. I'd like to begin with a definition of a blog, or a weblog, blog being short for a weblog. And I went to the place that looked like the authoritative source for me, which was blogger.com. And at blogger.com, I'm told that a blog is a personal diary, a daily pulpit, a collaborative space, a political soapbox, a breaking news outlet, a collection of links, your own private thoughts, memos to the world. There are millions of them in all shapes and sizes, and there are no rules. Blogs have reshaped the web, impacted politics, shaken up journalism, and enabled millions of people to have a voice and connect with others. Well, I hope that helps. Someone has described the blogosphere as the biggest coffee house on earth. Let me ask you a question, those of you in the room. How many of you have ever posted anything on a blog on the internet, personally? How many of you do that on a regular basis? And how many of you have actually found useful or interesting information on an internet blog? Well, those responses aren't at all surprising, because some sources now estimate that there are as many as 100 million blogs. And that's a number that is said to be growing by tens of thousands a month. There is a blog for every interest. As varied as your interest might be, somebody out there has a blog, if not you, someone else, that gives you an opportunity to participate in a conversation with other people on the subject. Andy Warhol once said, in the future, everyone will be famous for 15 minutes. And more recently, it's been said, in the future, everyone will be famous for 15 people. And so some blogs probably have that kind of readership, but we know that some have great influence and actually have very, very large readership. According to a Pew Research study last August, a quarter of all Americans get news from the internet. 38% of these use the internet as their primary source of news, and those people are younger and better educated than the public as a whole. A separate study involving respondents in 10 countries found that online news sources are the first choice of 1 in 5 18 to 24-year-olds, compared to only 3% of people aged 55 to 64. I'll keep my eyes directed down here as I read that. A fellow named David Perlmutter has written a book entitled Blog Wars, and he says, people call blogs new media, but they're no more new to my 20-year-old students than fire and the wheel. They grew up with it. They speak in blog. Online news sources, as often as not, include blogs, especially since search engines and aggregators of online content like Yahoo don't generally or necessarily separate weblogs from professional news organizations or other sources of information available at our fingertips. Bloggers cover business, entertainment, sports, religion, virtually any topic we can think of, but they seem to exert more influence in politics than anywhere else. One of our panelists kept reminding me that as we talk about blogs, we need to remember that as interesting as the business blogging topic might be, that the political blogging is where it's really happening. So that may be true. If you think of the Drudge Report or the Huffington Post or other blogs that regularly actually come to our attention through traditional media, we know that there's great impact there. A study by researchers at Texas Tech and the University of Tennessee last year found that, and I'll just quote them, politically interested internet users rely more on blogs than any other news source for news and information, and blogs are judged as more credible than online newspaper sites, online television sites, and online broadcast news sites. Similarly, we found that politically interested internet users judged blogs as more credible than either portal or mainstream news sites. Blogs scored highest for depth and lowest on fairness, but scores for all credibility measures, including accuracy, depth, believability, and fairness, were generally higher for blogs than for mainstream or portal media sites. The New York Times ran a story on February 25th that I thought did a good job of perhaps raising some interesting questions about what counts as journalism today. Some of you may have seen this article in the Times. It was headed, "Blogger Sans Pajamas, Rakes Muck and a Prize." And the article tells us about somebody named Josh Marshall, who's a very successful blogger who's actually making a lot of money as a blogger. And it says that on Tuesday it was announced that he had won a George Polk Award for legal reporting for coverage of the firing of 8 U.S. attorneys. The citation read, "The tenacious investigative reporting sparked interest by the traditional news media and led to the resignation of Attorney General Alberto Gonzales." Also last week, the article says, the Justice Department put him back on its mailing list for reporters with credentials after removing him last year. To scores of bloggers, this was a case of local boy makes good. Many took it as vindication of their enterprise, that anyone can assume the mantle of reporting on pressing issues affecting the nation and the world, with the imprimatur of a mainstream media outlet or not. And most reassuringly, it showed that fair numbers of people out there are paying attention. And the article, I'll read one more excerpt from the article. The article says, "Mr. Marshall does not shy away from the notion of blogging. I think of us as journalists. The medium we work in is blogging." I was recently in a meeting with Julia Wallace, the editor of the Atlanta Journal and Constitution, and she raised a question that I think was probably more rhetorical than anything else, and she said, "What will journalism look like for future generations?" And I think that's a really great question. It really begs us to think about where is all this heading. We couldn't have imagined the blogosphere as we know it today 10 years ago. And it's hard to imagine what it's becoming. Clearly, something is evolving before our eyes that's changing the way we interact with the world around us. So I'd like to pose our first question to the panel along the lines of that question. And what I'd like to ask you is this. Some people have referred to blogging as citizen journalism and likened it to the pamphleteers who helped rouse public support for the American Revolution. I'd like for you to comment on whether, in your opinions, there are still any distinctions to be made other than the medium itself between journalism and blogging. Is, in fact, blogging just another expression of journalism, or is there something qualitatively different here? And you might actually comment as well on who qualifies as a journalist and why might it matter. And Leah, why don't we start with you?
Oh, of course. I thought you were going to ask me what it would all look like in 10 years, and I was going to say, if I knew that, I wouldn't be on the panel. I'd be off, getting venture capital or something. But first of all, I think that when you talk about blogging, it's more important to think of it as a technological tool than it is as an entity in itself, because some bloggers do reporting. And that's, to me, what the distinction is as to whether or not they are journalists or not, is whether or not you're doing reporting. So you can be on a blog tool and just be expressing an opinion or talking about an interest. That's not necessarily journalism. As for who's a journalist, before the web came along, that question wasn't even clearly resolved. So I'm not sure I have the answer to that. And while I think those issues are important, I don't think that it's necessary to have that all nailed down for it to be abuse and for it to be. I mean, we're gonna knock that out over individual cases, just like for the Scooter Libby trial. There were bloggers who were members of actually a blog organization that were credentialed to be in there. We've also now got Mark Cuban in Dallas saying no more bloggers in his press box. I think we're going to fight this out on an individual basis and eventually arrive at some distinction. But some of those distinctions will be made by courts over protection for journalists, what protection is left for journalists.
Well, Jeremy, I won't assume that you speak for every blogger in the room, but as somebody who blogs regularly, do you consider yourself a journalist? And how do you distinguish between a blogger and a journalist, if at all?
Well, much like John, I had to go look up the word journalist earlier today, and it still says in the new Webster's, a journalist writes for a newspaper or a periodical. And I come at it from a background that really offers more of what does this all mean. And I'd also like to thank John for allowing me to clean up today and get out of my pajamas and come down here. I think the word blogger is a real problem for me, and just on a personal level. I didn't, wake up one day and decide I wanted to be a blogger. My weblog grew out of a business, and it grew out of a business that involves working with leaders on how they create a brand for themselves and how they manage their leadership positions. And I arrived at it almost ironically. It was about a year or two ago. I actually rebranded what I had to that point. And ironically, it was this 75-year-old senior statesman of an industry who I really admire and respect. And he said, we really need a voice for some of these leadership issues. And, from my standpoint, what blogs are doing now is addressing a real need. There's a need for a richer, deeper awareness, knowledge, understanding of some of these issues. These issues that we face are very complex. And to me, it boils down to an audience of one sometimes, and really making sure that you're aware of who you are addressing at each time. As far as whether we're all going to be journalists, I don't think the business model has been put together yet. And until the business model for business blogging is put together, I just don't see myself or any other quote blogger being recognized as a full-time journalist. At least not yet. That doesn't mean it can't change tomorrow or in the next hour.
What about the others of you?
Greg, do you have
Any thoughts on that, Rick?
Sure. Matter of fact, I think we need to recognize that there's something that is a foundational element to our discussion, and that's the First Amendment. We cannot start any discussion about what is journalism and what is not journalism, or who is not a journalist, without understanding the purpose, the way the First Amendment is implemented. It seems to me that the First Amendment says nothing about journalists. It says nothing about journalism. The First Amendment talks about freedom of speech and freedom of the press. I adhere to the view that late Justice William Brennan took, which is that they are not necessarily redundant concepts, but that one is a means to the end, which is the other. That freedom of the press is the means to the end of public debate, political debate in America. This country is founded on this idea of information sharing, information selling, information movement. And I think we have to recognize that it has something in that regard. Because of that, I personally have a real difficult time with anyone who attempts to define what a journalist is or what journalism is, because to do so, in my mind, would limit the First Amendment. And I have a real legal basic background and a problem with that, but I have a professional background problem with that, where it's like, I just don't know how that's going to work. I'm reminded that back in the colonial period, which John sort of set us off starting with, that overwhelming majority of your early journalists, your editors, were in fact postmasters who stole information from other newspapers from across the ocean to redistribute, which is exactly what some blogs now do. Borrow and repost, I believe is the term they use these days, as opposed to steal. But I think it's also worth recognizing that one of our dilemmas when we talk about this idea of defining journalism is that we need to remind ourselves what it was that made this country unique when we began to found it. And I don't propose to get on a soapbox and give you a history lesson here, but the concept of licensing is exactly the concept that the First Amendment is supposed to work against. We hated licensing by the British Crown. We believe that anybody should be able to discuss, anybody should be able to participate in government and debate, and therefore many people will tell you that if the U.S. Constitution stands against anything from a communication standpoint, it's against the concept of prior restraint in the form of licensing. Now, let me just remind you just a couple other things, and I'll get on and we'll have some more discussion here. We talk about how you define journalism. We look them up in the dictionary. I looked up what a journalist was, but I looked it up in the Department of Labor job description. There is no definition. There's writer, there's editor, but there is no definition of journalist in the Department of Labor books, and I think that's important to recognize. I don't think that it should matter that the future of this new media, this blogging, for a large number of people, is that it is a very self-centered, highly individualistic process. That has no bearing on whether it's protected or not. I don't think it should matter in any way, whether that in any way determines whether someone is credentialed or not. I do see two problems that I just want to pose right now before I finish up here. And one is the idea of being credentialed. We are allowing people to define for us who a journalist is by the credentialing process. And secondly is the idea of reporter's privilege. We're allowing state legislatures to define for us who is and who is not a journalist through the statutory process. And if you read Georgia's Shield Law, I'm not exactly sure I really like who is and who is not a journalist, according to our esteemed colleagues down the street. So I guess I'd say one thing, just as we're in closing here, and that is one of my favorite cases, which is called First National Bank versus Bellotti. Chief Justice Warren Burger years ago basically had a really nice comment. He said the First Amendment belongs to all who exercises freedoms. And then I say amen.
I get to follow that. Huh? Smokes.
Better you than me.
Yeah. I'm going to take my Equifax hat off for a second and just say one thing. I remember when I started in journalism back in the 80s, and I came to the Business Chronicle, and we were an upstart. We were the weekly business journal, and frankly, most of us couldn't get interviews with the daily newspapers because we were not considered to be credible journalists. Why? Well, you hadn't worked on a daily. Well, what make working on a daily make you a more credible journalist than someone who's worked at a weekly or worked at a wire service? If you haven't worked at a daily, you don't understand the routine and all that. So we were a bunch of outcasts for the most part. Young kids doing things. And then we broke some big stories, and folks started paying a little more attention to us. And then next thing you knew, a couple of our best people get hired away by the Wall Street Journal. Then a couple of big awards come along, and we win, Anderson Awards from UCLA's business school, and we get Pulitzer considerations. And wait a minute, but you were just an upstart business journal. What? You guys aren't supposed to be playing in that ballpark. Well, guess what? That's how I feel bloggers are today in many cases. There are a group of bloggers out there who are doing some really great work in certain arenas that are very powerful and definitely need to be considered by mainstream established journalism and not ignored. And I think it's up to mainstream established journalism to take them more seriously and to interact with them and make them part of the process. That's the good news. The bad news is, because it's such a Wild West situation, companies like that, put my Equifax hat back on for a second, companies like ours spend a lot of time and resources looking to protect our own brand identities from the dangers of a rogue blogger who is just trying to ruin a company, just trying to take it down, whether it's true or false. Forget that for a second. If they're out to ruin you, you have to be very protective of your company's brand. That's my job. So I think blogging is fantastic. I'm a very active reader of blogs all the time on many different fronts. I think it's great. But there is a degree of responsibility that comes with it. And for a company like ours, we have to be very careful because it's fraught with danger for us if we're not paying close attention to what goes on within a blogging community.
David, I want to come back to you on this next question and sort of follow up on what you just introduced, which is how is this affecting the work that you do at Equifax? I did a book last year in which I argued that business has now entered a new era of hyper-accountability. What I meant by hyper-accountability is that you're being held to account by countless people with countless interests 24/7. That that today there are people who are questioning everything you do, who are demanding increasing transparency about everything you do. There are people who are second-guessing every decision that's made, and those people may be your employees, they may be former employees, they may be customers, they may be people who are associated with interest groups that have an interest in what your business does. And in many cases, for large organizations, the number seems virtually endless. How do you monitor this space? How do you keep up with what's being said about the organization? How do you sort of discern what deserves response and merits some legitimate consideration, and what can be dismissed and turned away from with that kind of noise out there? I think about companies like Walmart and Coca-Cola, where they have separate web pages that are called, CokeFacts.com, WalmartFacts.com, and those pages exist to set the record straight from their point of view in clarifying or countering things that are being said elsewhere on the internet, often by bloggers. And so it seems to me that there's a degree of judgment that has to be exercised here in deciding who really should be engaged seriously and responded to seriously, and who doesn't. How do you navigate that? So there were a couple of articles I saw just in the last month as I was doing some research on this, one of which was in the Wall Street Journal and was co-authored by a professor over at Georgia Tech in the management department. And what he says here is, it's no holds barred. Companies can face a constant barrage of criticism on the web from employees, ex-employees, customers with grievances, advocacy groups with agendas. Managers shouldn't underestimate the potential for such attacks to damage the reputation of the company or brand. The web's global reach and ease of access gives critics a powerful tool for spreading messages. And then he goes on and talks in the article here about Walmart and some of the things that Walmart is trying to do to get a handle on this huge number of critics that a company like Walmart, largest retailer in the world, faces. There was also a piece a little earlier in Business Week, actually 3 years ago in May, there was a cover story, and the cover story's headline was, "Blogs Will Change Your Business." And so think back 3 years ago, I'm sure a lot has happened since then. The writer says, "Go ahead and bellyache about blogs, but you cannot afford to close your eyes to them because they're simply the most explosive outbreak in the information world. And they're going to shake up just about every business, including yours. It doesn't matter whether you're shipping paper clips, pork bellies, or videos of Britney in a bikini. Blogs are a phenomenon you cannot ignore, postpone, or delegate. Given the changes barreling down upon us, blogs are not a business elective, they're a prerequisite." And then this writer poses the question, how does business change when everyone is a potential publisher? So I guess my question to you, given that it's been 3 years since that question came out, how has business changed in the last 3 years or the last 5 years in adapting to this new communication environment?
Well, first of all, I think all companies, let's use Equifax as an example. I consider Equifax, while it is a publicly traded company owned by shareholders, we are viewed by the general public as being part of what I call the public trust. What does that mean? It means that everyone in this room has a credit report. And as such, and a credit report is a private document that's created by Equifax that's used by lenders to decide whether or not you're going to get a loan or not. Yeah, but to people out in this audience, they probably say, well, that's my credit report. So there's this sense of entitlement by consumers, and rightfully so, that it is their information that is on our credit report. So the passion that gets going in discussions about Equifax and its role and how it communicates with consumers is a hot topic for blogs, and understandably so. But guess what? It's been a hot topic before blogs even existed. So how has our business changed to adapt it? It hasn't changed in the sense that we still address consumers' concerns as seriously as we always have. What's changed is the communications mechanisms that exist for us to deal with those issues. So, yes, we track blogs on a daily basis. Do we interact with every blog? Absolutely not. When do we interact with blogs? Well, if the blog is raised to a certain credible standard whereby there is a need to respond, we will consider responding. But there are a lot of constituencies within Equifax who are reticent to do so I'm constantly battling that battle to get into the fight a little bit more. But the truth of the matter is, for any corporation, the reason why there's always been this great dynamic that exists between business and the media in general is because A business wants to control what goes on in its world. That's how they establish their brand. That's how they maintain their brand. They make sure they control what's going on. Blogging is the 180-degree opposite direction from that. It takes control out of my CEO's daily life, and it drives him crazy. Okay? And no one likes it. When you're trying to do everything in your power to run your company as best as you can to increase shareholder value, when you know that at any given point someone could pop something on a website or write something in a newspaper, it doesn't matter if it's the blog or it's the Journal-Constitution, my job is to help protect the brand of the company, and that's the problem. It's that control issue that goes on.
Can I add something to that? I mean, you made a couple of comments I want to make sure we're aware of. You talked about the company's huge number of critics. I used to be an editorial page editor up in Marietta eons ago, and it occurs to me that no one actually has. That's maybe the wrong way to phrase it, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. What I mean by that is to say that every letter that we got a complaint, you could almost assume as the tip of the iceberg. There were others there who simply hadn't bothered to take the time to actually post and write and sort of follow through. And to my mind, one of the major advantages, I guess, of the web is this shifting away from a one-way communication model to a two-way communication model. And it may be that, indeed, what you simply need is to do better communicating as opposed to damage control. You need to be more proactive. You need to be out front doing these types of things. And it also, I guess, raises the question of who owns information. I'll reveal a little bit of how long I've been in the industry. One time there was an Elvis concert in Macon. I'll let you guys figure out how old I am based on that. But we got major criticism of the review we did on this, and it's because some of the letter writers believed they owned that meaning of that event. And that's not at all like we're seeing here. Whether credit reporting or anything else in the web, people believe they own the meaning, the concept, the content of that information.
Well, Leah, it can't be that different even for a newspaper, because now you live in an environment where you have created opportunities for people to interact with your newspaper in ways that they didn't in the past. It's different from just putting a letter in the mail, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely, and that word control is very important, because I think that's been one of the journeys that many, can I say the word journalists? We haven't decided who it is, but anyway, that journalists at major news organizations have had to, a journey they've had to go on to realize that it is that conversation is going to go on. It's either going to go on your website or it's going to go on somewhere else. And that there is a limit to how you control it. It's not a matter of letters to the editors coming in and you picking and choosing one or two to publish. It's much freer. And so in the same way that you've had to nudge people along, that's been one of the journeys that you still see news organizations going through too.
You have something?
No, in listening to all this, I think the core of it for me is what David mentioned, trust and confidence. And everybody in this room, either through a career path or a business focus, whether you're networking or whatever else, I think blogs can enrich this return to trust in the individual, trust in a trusted authority, somebody who really is doing it for the right reasons. I see huge potential in blogs as a resource for that, because I think, if we're really honest with ourselves, the public trust has been pretty rapidly disintegrated in recent years, and we're not going to put it back together again. But what's happened is this fragmentation and this explosion of new media, and I would just offer it to you as members of this audience and obviously interested in the issue. Think about it. I mean, if you read something, if you gather information, if you have to report to a manager or a leader of your organization, at the core of that is trust and confidence. And if what we're talking about doesn't lead to that, then we're doing, everyone in this room is doing themselves a disservice.
Don't you think that's where we're heading, though? I mean, I think what's going to happen, I think the market is going to bear that out. I think over time, it's going to be the survival of the fittest in terms of blogs that end up establishing a reputation, such as the ones we were talking about, Huffington Report, for example. It's established itself now. We're starting to see a separation now between almost two universes of blogs, where there are ones that are now becoming more trusted sources for information, and you're going to see more of that. You're going to see more of a differentiation. The best part about all this is we were all talking about how the newspapers are dying. It's a dying art. Well, guess what? They're being reinvented. They're just being reinvented in the form of the blogosphere and the wiki economics of dialogue. It's just a whole new way of approaching the media.
One of the issues of trust that I think, Jeremy, you kind of brought the word into conversation that fascinates me is that the traditional news media, through journalism programs, through Society of Professional Journalists and so forth, have really well established and well articulated standards of professional conduct. And people who aspire to sort of go into the profession, as it were, through those traditional pathways have been exposed to that. They take classes from people like Greg Lisby, and they learn about journalistic ethics. And yet, we've seen a precipitous decline in trust of the news media, the traditional news media, over the last several years. In fact, the last 20 or 30 years, it's probably been in steady decline, according to Gallup. And so my question is, given that effort to establish trust by, in a sense, creating a sense of accountability to standards in traditional media, hasn't really caused a great deal of public trust in traditional media, either through failure to live up to those standards or whatever reason it might be. What possibility is there for establishing some standard of ethical practice in the blogosphere? And what I'm thinking of is that some of the questions that seem to emerge frequently are, you don't know who you're dealing with. People misrepresent themselves. The CEO of Whole Foods was on a blog posting stuff under a different name. At least with the traditional media, that we always had the sense that we knew who we were dealing with, but there's a kind of an anonymity about the internet that allows people to present themselves in ways that maybe aren't always true. And I guess my question is, how do we establish trust in that kind of an environment? How do we know that people are dealing with one another in an ethical manner? Or do we just assume that this is self-policing and eventually the bad guys, wash out?
Well,
And some are making that argument, by the way.
Well, I'll take that. I mean, I think maybe I'm not sure we're going to be able to do that. Maybe we ought to give up that thought at the moment and recognize that people are finding other ways to handle that. And that's why you have so much social networking going on, because people look to their friends, people they know, they trust in the same way that, in a small town years ago, you would have listened to an authority figure tell you something. As we've had a decline generally in trust in institutions over the last 30 years, I think that's why social networking has become and will continue to be a more and more powerful tool. You see a lot of, particularly younger people, they don't get their news even from going. They don't get it necessarily from going to a website for a news organization. They don't even necessarily get it from going to Yahoo where they collect it. They get it from it being sent to them by a friend or by it being posted on one of their friends' Facebook pages, see what they've aggregated. So, the challenge obviously for a news organization is how do we find the financial model to finance the journalism. But in terms of can we sort out or enforce standards on blogs? I think that's kind of a conversation. It's kind of a non-starter. There may be some you want a credential. There may be some people who want to join it, but I don't think that's the end-all, be-all answer to the Wild West of the web.
I don't disagree with the complexity of this question, but I just get back to trust, confidence, and credibility. I know I sound like a repetitive record at this point, but in other words, if I know my audience, which I think I really do, and I enlighten them and inform them and bring them a context that's richer than they're going to get elsewhere, and they trust me to never betray, truth, disclosure, whether it's editorial or reporting, which is just as simple as putting a tag at the top of some of these things and saying it's editorial. As long as I stay true to that, and I would encourage anyone who blogs or who wants to blog or thinks they've blogged to keep that in mind, because it really is that simple. And I don't profess to be an expert on how we elevate the standards for all of this. I just think it has to happen, or it has to begin at a one-to-one level. And once that starts happening and there's some acceptance that we need the standards, then that will take shape.
And what I'm hearing is from both of you is that those who earn credibility will probably be successful in attracting people who rely on them for information the same as anyone else. Interestingly, there is a website with a code of ethics for bloggers where somebody's actually promoting this. And it's not bad stuff. I mean, it's the stuff you're talking about, Jeremy. It's the idea that this would actually be good practice for anyone who wants to build trust with an audience of readers. So there are some efforts along those lines.
Yeah, if that's self-perpetuating, that's a great idea. I mean, if that's something that grows out of the blogosphere, that bloggers rally around it and say, you know what, we're sick and tired of being lumped in with some of these people who are being unethical. Let's create it and let it. If that's something that evolves out of the blogosphere, great, that's fantastic. But it's not going to be set by any standards board. It's not going to be set by the government. It's not going to be set by. It's going to have to be set by that community itself. And if that community feels that's the best way to participate and it can hold water, that will succeed. Otherwise, there's no reason in some holier than thou, someone or other come to the table and say, we're going to have standards and you must adhere to them. That won't happen.
And at the university, we're very unlikely to begin teaching courses in blogging ethics, right, Greg?
I bet you I could get a full class. I think I probably could.
Can I ask a question now? Are we talking, when you're talking about trust, are you talking only about the blogger, or what about the commenters?
Well, it seems to me that when we start talking about this idea of blogging and commenters and so forth, there's a simple model that maybe, and I apologize if it seems too elementary because some of my students claim that I am a bit elementary here, but it very simply works this way. It says truth-telling creates trust, trust creates community. There you have it. That's what journalism really is all about. And when we start finding this decline in community, you can almost entirely, every time, work it back to a decline in trust, then to a decline somewhere along the line in the idea of truth-telling. And it may well be that you make a statement that turns out later to be true, Dan Rather and his George Bush things. It may well be that you simply haven't verified. It may well be that you're asking someone to take your word for something on a matter of privilege, and they are unwilling to do so. In my 30-odd years as a journalist and an educator now, one of the things I have found is that too often we expect people to defer to our expertise without reminding ourselves that we have to daily remind them why we are deserving of their trust. Now, I'll go one step further, if I may. I mean, we're talking about ethical standards here. Society of Professional Journalists' ethical standards are some of the best known. And yet, I don't know if I should do this or not, but should we dare ask for a show of hands how many people can recite all 7 of them? I suspect nobody. And I suspect nobody because they're really not ethical standards. They are not well established. They are not well articulated, despite the fact that they've been around since 1923, I believe, when they first started here. We need to recognize that when we start talking about the idea of how we work things out, that the SPJ code, number one, is not enforceable, and there's a whole line of discussion about whether it actually should be enforceable because, sure, we enforce the code of ethics on doctors and lawyers and cosmetologists. I'll get that right in a minute. But maybe we don't. Maybe we should on journalists. But then you have to define again who's a journalist, who's licensed, and we go back to my beginning comment about the problem of licensing. It seems to me, and I'll put it very simply, it seems to me that from an ethical, philosophical perspective, all journalists, and perhaps even all of us in this room, are good old Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill utilitarians, which basically means we communicate what we believe to be the greatest good for the greatest number, and we cause the least harm to the fewest. Now, if you note, the problem with that nice little summary there is that doesn't necessarily require truth-telling, because the greatest good might not be telling the truth. I'm sorry, did I kill the conversation? I apologize.
Speechless, Ed, really. One issue that I've sort of followed the last year or so is the number of CEOs who are now posting their own blogs, and that's become very commonplace for CEOs to have blogs. And I think that most of us wouldn't be the least bit surprised if a CEO stood up here in this room as they frequently do, and gave a speech that was written by a corporate speechwriter. And in fact, they might even give a speech that they haven't even read until they walked into the room that day to deliver the speech. And we've had that happen as well. But it seems to me that when the CEO has a blog, that there is some expectation, because of the nature of the blogosphere, that it ought to be authentic, that it actually ought to be that individual responding to questions or giving a point of view on the blog. What are your thoughts on that?
Why must
Sort
it
of
be authentic?
ghost-written blogs.
Why must it be authentic?
Well, I think there's an expectation. in the blogosphere of a kind of personal authenticity and personal authorship that we may not have in some other kinds of CEO communication. I mean, you may be right that that's not an issue.
Well, personally speaking, John, I think the CEO blog is a good idea, but again, it gets back. You mentioned John Mackey at Whole Foods and the trouble he got in with some of his blogging activities. He actually, how the issue all really originated was on chat rooms. And to your point, he was using a different name or alias. But what was going on at the time happened to be an antitrust issue with a merger that they were trying to execute. So, I mean, again, I think it's fine for a CEO to have a level of personal authenticity. And I know that hasn't been a very familiar or popular topic over the past few years. But, I mean, you kind of, it's like leadership itself. I mean, you either have it or you don't. I mean, you see it, you believe it. I mean, we all have people that we turn to. I'm not so sure a CEO blog, per se, is going to, turn that. But, getting back to Mackey, again, it was a business issue first. And whatever medium you want to, whatever medium of the social media you want to call it, it all goes back to the antitrust issue.
I would think for business people that the more interesting area for the CEO, whose voice you hear a lot, is the blogs that are done by employees, either sanctioned by the company or, actually as part of their job, or at least sanctioned and agreed to by the company. And then also the comments and blogs that are done by citizens, by the public, and what they may say about you. That's the area really of interest for you. I think actually Walmart's a very interesting case in how they've evolved on everything from being proactive, where during Katrina, they had their PR people out on blogs commenting to get out the word of what Walmart was doing to help Katrina. And then they also have set up, fact websites to try and counter groups that have been critical of them. And now they've got some of their own employees, as part of their job, reviewing products on their own blogs within, Walmart sanctions. I think it's fascinating, sort of how they've begun utilizing the web in all these different ways. However you feel about Walmart, I think they're very out in front, and there's a lot of lessons to be learned from what they're doing with it.
I typically speak for my CEO, but I'm not going to speak for him tonight. In the sense that, yes, we do some communicating for him. I promise you that if I came to him and said, Rick, how about you do a blog? He'd look at me and say, no way. I would never do that, because it would need to come from me. I wouldn't have time to do it. I wouldn't have time to keep it up. I have global responsibilities. I can't make that my number one priority right now, and I'm not about to put you or anyone else in this company in the position of talking for me. That is not fair to you. It's not fair to the company, not fair to the shareholders, and it's certainly not fair to the audience that's going to be hearing the message. And that's the kind of guy he is. He just wouldn't want to deal with that. Now, that said, the whole idea of, Leah's totally right. The best place for blogging is either within the company or with your customers. We have, it's almost becoming a bit of a buzzword within business right now, but the whole concept around innovation. All right, Equifax is trying to put its money where its mouth is around the word innovation. How do you innovate new products to help your customers solve their problems? Well, one of the ways is to use this blogging concept to create a way to input ideas from all 7,000 of our employees from 15 countries, coming up with ideas and collaborating on ways to come up with better ways to solve problems in ways that we've never been able to in the past. And it is a phenomenal success to have this this way of innovating all the time, and we're generating tons of ideas that we hope it's going to create sort of this internal think tank, almost like a Bell Labs kind of model, to help come up with the next great idea that maybe is going to help solve some of our problems. So
Another use of the tool.
that's a really positive way that, I mean, blogging works, but we don't call it blogging, but it's using the internet as a way to communicate with each other in a totally open and free environment where no one needs to be identified, and it's really powerful.
If I could add one thing to that, though, there is an issue that we sort of are not hitting on directly, and that is this idea that when we say authentic, we assume personal, all right, as opposed to institutional or something else. And it seems to me that we have to recognize that there are many industries and areas of our lives that we do not have personal or authentic communication. I had the good fortune to be a clerk at the Georgia Supreme Court, and I can tell you that the justices don't write their own opinions. You know, others do. I've worked with a film director on a film, and I can tell you the film director is not the author of the film. So why should it be any different for CEOs?
Because there's a certain degree of accountability to the CEO. You're right, there's a different level of standard.
Right.
I think there's an understanding that a Supreme Court justice does not write his own opinion. I think that's a universally accepted thought. If a CEO is giving a speech, it is believed that the CEO's thoughts are coming from the CEO and not from a mouthpiece standing behind it.
Right.
And that's the way, frankly, the way it should be. Yeah, because, I mean, in terms of protecting the brand of the company, you want that CEO to be speaking from his heart about what he wants to say, not have it come from someone else in the organization.
But maybe the other person can do a better job of proposing what's in his heart.
Then that other person can be the one doing the talking.
Maybe you need a new CEO. Why don't we open this up to some questions and comments from the room? We've run a little longer in this part of the program than I expected us to, frankly, and I want to still allow time for this.
Michelle Moore. One of the things about the blogosphere is you have an abundance of attractive alternatives immediately. And I think in writing, you have to really deliver immediate gratification. Otherwise, people are just going to click away. And I wanted to know how you felt that affected quote journalism. And the second question was, if only 3% of people over 55 use the blogs, and they don't think this is journalism, how do the people in their 20s and 30s, do they view it as journalism? Do they have a different standard? But what about that immediate gratification? If you don't have that hook there, others people will click away.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think to summarize what we've been kind of arriving at, it's a user-generated community. It's an active medium versus a passive. I'm going to go get my newspaper and they're just going to tell me what's kind of going on. So to your point about having to really hit it with a news hook and being concise and informative. I mean, because you look at the average page view on the internet versus sitting down on a Saturday or Sunday with a rich set of papers or magazines. I hope some of you still do that. The average page view is nowhere in a minute. I mean, what can you gather in a minute? And I look at average page views, and if I get more than a minute, I'm like, wow, something's working here. So, no, it's a very good question, though, because you really do have to capture it a lot more quickly and succinctly than I think you do in more of a passive consumer response.
There was
a point made that any kind of sort of seal of approval had to come from within the group. And I'm wondering whether that has to be the model. For example, today we all recognize the credibility, if you're in the business school environment, of AACSB. And that's the accrediting agency for all business schools. But the way it started is, and I forget the exact number, that 10 or 13 or somewhere of that order, approximately 10 schools got together and said, let's create this accrediting body. And so my question is, why can't 10 credible sources just get together and say, let's do this, let's create this? It could even be a business opportunity for someone to come along and say, let's do this, let's get some credibility by incorporating the 10 most credible sites and start this process. It may work or it may not. I agree that the inherent credibility has to come from that community, but I'm not sure that it needs to be entirely a grassroots thing. It could be, as I said, 10 people could get together and say, let's do it.
Well, my sense is that the blogging has a certain anti-establishment quality about it in the first place. So the mere let's say that Yahoo, MSN, I don't know, name your favorite aggregator. They all came together and decided, here we are going to establish a certain policy for blogging. I promise you, within a nanosecond, there's going to be a blogger out there saying, here's the antidote to that, and here's what mine's going to look like. So that's why it needs to germinate from the ground up. And if it is, if it was the leading 10 business schools that decided to set up an accreditation, my guess is they were some of the leading business schools within the community. Other business schools aspired to be on the same level of those other 10. So there was a degree of acceptance and not that same kind of renegade quality that existed maybe in the accreditation process. So in order for this to work, I still think it's going to have to, you're right, it could start off with one major source, but they're just going to have to put it out there and say, okay, here's a seed, I'm planting it. World, come at me and tell me how it's going to work. And then over time, it could create some level of broad establishment. But I think if it's a large group of the big players, I think it's going to fall on the same death knell that some other media would have fallen.
This is actually a thing that Greg and I were talking about before the program this evening. I think that there's something about the establishment of standards, or the absence of standards, that makes the internet a very nebulous place in terms of ferreting out what really is authoritative or accurate information. And we see it in the classroom. If you assign a student to do a research paper, you have to go through a lot of discussion now about how to discern what's authoritative on the internet, because there's a lot of information on the internet that's just flat not true, or it's not accurate. But it's very difficult, absent any kind of a whatever you called it, Baruz, a sort of a seal of approval, for a student to look at a website which might look very attractive and very professional and know if the information there is in fact good information that can be used in a research paper. And so I think that this has been a new challenge, dealing with younger people who are internet natives, helping them understand that doing research is different from just surfing the net. And there are certainly authoritative sources on the net that are very credible, but not everything on the net is, and it's hard to discern that.
The web is a great equalizer for information. Everything is credible, basically, when you link to it and click on it. And yet, so many things you have to say, well, let me check this out further. We all have, I think, good familiarity with Wikipedia's problem about John Siegenthaler shooting Robert Kennedy, I believe it was, a couple of years ago. That created a fascinating discussion, but John Siegenthaler, no, not involved in the Kennedy assassination whatsoever. Well, Wikipedia sure said it was, and matter of fact, as he tried to correct it, got into some major ugly exchanges with those who would defend this position. And you're sitting there thinking, why are people so willing to believe this? And that may be a Kennedy conspiracy. I don't know. We love that conspiracy. It's been alive for so long. But, I tell my students up front, no Wikipedia. And they look at me like I just cut off their right hand. Right?
Steve, who else you have there?
I'm Arnie Harris, and I don't know if you hear this. I've got a website called arnieharris.com, or The Bald Truth. The truth, the whole truth, nothing but the bald truth. And I put it up as sort of a lark around the time that James Brown's demise happened, when I got about 7 seconds of his wedding video from his widow. And the thing kind of took off and took on a life of its own, sort of entertainment stuff, some things that have grown out of my work with Entertainment Tonight, and had about 1.2 million page views in the last year. The dilemma is now I'm a target of people who may not like the reporting that I do. I try to bring the same standards that I have, in my past incarnations at CNN, The Washington Post, and elsewhere. But the dilemma from someone like me, and I want to throw this to the panel, much like David at Equifax, if you have a brand, however humble, how do you defend against the crazies, and is it really worth, the tar baby strategy is, I don't want to punch it because I'll get stuck. At the same time, if you're standing in the way of someone recovering a lot of money in a lawsuit and your voice is not appreciated, if you're alone in the wilderness, do you align yourself with a major outfit? Do you somehow incorporate a group of followers? And I think there are out there who appreciate what facts are. I don't, for the independent blogger who also does other things, do you have any advice?
I would say finesse and a little self-deprecating humor.
Well, what about some of the other bloggers in the room? We've got people here who are independent bloggers, I think, and perhaps some of you have experienced the same thing. How do you deal with people who respond to you in ways that are...
If someone's truly crazy, 90% of the people are in the party.
That's a very good point. If someone, I'm going to repeat it for the air because it's true. If someone's crazy, 90% of the people in the room, in the chat room, know that person's crazy, and that is how I view it for Equifax. When we are taken to task in a website, oftentimes there's a lot of emotion around someone's personal issue, and people read it with I think the market bears that out. I think if it raises to the point where it's of critical nature, where we feel the need to respond, we will do so. But that doesn't happen very often. Because oftentimes these things, first of all, we can deal with it offline. If someone's personal problem, we want to deal with it offline. We're not interested in sharing it with the world. It's their personal problem. Let's take care of them. They're obviously in pain. They're looking to get something out. We want to get to them and talk to them and take care of their problems. So,
yeah. Something, and bloggers jump in, agree. But I think one of the ways that a blogger can protect themselves, enhance their credibility and their visibility is by creating their own community, and that's with you link to people you trust to their blogs and get them to link to you and create that network in that way.
people defend you.
We had said that we would conclude at 7:30. My sense is that most of you are happy to continue this, and I hope so, because I'd like for us to continue a little longer. But I also want to say that if you're on a schedule and expected to leave around this time, please know that no one will be offended if you need to make your way out. But I hope you'll stay and be part of the conversation for a bit longer. I'm sorry.
My name's Paul Young. I was curious. I came down here tonight very curious to hear what y'all had to say. I'm particularly noticing that in the old style media, there seems to be a reluctance to do some pretty candid self-examination. And I guess I go to blogs because at least they all know that they have no credibility or they have no credentials, and I would like to find news. I'm sorry, I'm not phrasing this very well. The commodity is news. The value add is your integrity. And when opinion just runs from the first word of a news report to the end, I might as well go read a blog that starts out by saying it's opinion. And when news isn't news but just entertainment, which has no mental content to it at all, I might as well go to a blog where at least they're saying that I may be wrong, but I'm sticking to my focus. And I'm wondering, where's the accountability by the old media? They keep saying the blogs are lowering the common denominator, but I think they're just ignoring the fact that they've got their own weaknesses. And I was hoping that we could see how blogs are enlightening the media to maybe raise its standards instead of just saying that it hasn't.
Well, I'm going to take issue with a couple of things by first saying parts of me may be old media, but we're also new media. So, we're part of the web world. And I'm not sure, you're making a judgment. If you read a story that you think is just opinion from the get-go, that in itself is an opinion.
Let me try to help.
Help me out. Because
let me defend Leah here for a second.
Thank you.
I think the big issue here, at the end of the day, it's all about business, all right? So large media companies are trying to figure out, they're looking at their subscription rates, they're looking at their advertising revenue online, and they're going, oh boy, we got an issue here. These bloggers are starting to take away our audience, and how are we going to be able to sell ads at the end of the day to help create the revenue to keep people employed and keep it going, right? So there's a bit of a dichotomy going on here. So they're taking it very seriously, and that's why digital media is so important for large media organizations to participate. And my hope is they will continue to grow and figure that out. I don't know if that's the defense you were looking for, but
I mean, in terms of our blogs taken away, first of all, we have blogs. I mean, we're part of that world.
But you started blogs in a way in response to the way the whole internet had exploded, the way people were using the internet.
Of course,
Right.
and we're changing just like your businesses look at what's happening in the marketplace, and you make all alterations, and you change the world. Certainly, yeah, we're looking for new business, trying to refigure the business model. But I guess it doesn't worry me that there's a lot of people out there blogging. I mean, it gives you more choices. If it makes me have to work harder to make you choose to come to me. But I don't think that that's a bad thing. I mean, a lot of people would have argued that the heyday of print journalism was when you had several newspapers competing against each other. So I think that the fact that a blogger can post news, as it happens, has made us have to get more nimble, and respond to what people are interested in. I mean, now, first of all, I don't know that it's a terrible thing for us to know what people are interested in, which we can tell by their viewing patterns online, as opposed to force feed, attempting to force feed stories that are of absolutely no interest or relevance to somebody except perhaps a journalist. Now, does that mean that there's not a place for serious long-form journalism that maybe not everybody's going to want to read? Absolutely. And there's a long tail to that, where people may come back to that, weeks later, whereas it would have just disappeared, as a fish wrapper or in the bird cage. So I guess I like the marketplace of ideas. Yeah, are there bumps along the road? Absolutely. But ultimately, I think it helps us get to the best points.
Yeah, just to follow on that, I think we have to recognize, getting back to some of the earlier comments, there is no real true effective model that's developed yet between amateur and user-generated content and mainstream media. Therefore, it is wild, wild west, like David was describing. And because there's no set, clear, sustainable model that's formed yet, it's a vacuum, all right? There's a vacuum of ideas, a vacuum of opinions, and what happens is there's a perception of conflict between, old media and new media. And to your question about standards, if we don't do something about what I'm describing, there isn't going to be any set of standards that addresses the core issue.
Some people would argue, though, that there is a model, and that model is a historic model. What did newspapers do back in the 19-teens and 1920s when they were threatened by radio? And the answer is they bought radio stations. They set up radio broadcast booths in the newspaper newsroom.
That's right.
This is not surprising. This is standard business operation here. You don't want to beat them. You want to enjoy them, buy them out, make it better.
Good point.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it makes it better, by the way. And the thing that I'm more worried about, I'm much less worried about the blogosphere than I am about media consolidation. When you have 5 or 6 big media companies owning most of the newspapers in the country, you have 5 or 6 media companies controlling all of the TV outlets and everything else. Thank God that we have blogs that get everyone else's voices out, and there's a counterweight to this consolidation where people like Fox and a few other people start to control the news in ways that I don't think is healthy for the democracy. So I'm up for blogs.
Except, if I may offer one caveat here, the Project for Excellence in Journalism Annual State of the News Media Report says this: another unexpected finding, citizen-created websites and blogs are actually less welcoming to outside commentary than the so-called mainstream media.
Well, I have my microphone away.
On the AJC blog is always Will Jones talking about how every story is an example of the Catholic fifth column conspiracy. My blog is the AJC wants to keep having Will Jones tell
Let's try to keep the comments with the mic, just so we can preserve this for later viewing. And the mic has found its way all the way to the back of the room now. So,
following on that, right now we're in a sort of nascent stage of the blogosphere, and everything is all innocence. Well-intentioned people, but there are forces afoot. Forces that would take over the blogosphere as well as the web and use it for profit. So there's a dangerous situation developing in media consolidation, Fox or News Corp, taking over former independent blogs and YouTube, MySpace, and all the rest. There is all of these independents here, and then there's corporate America that wants to insert itself in between and gather data and information gleaned from these blog sites and gleaned from the internet. And who's going to make the rules? The traffic rules that prevail at that intersection.
Anyone care to respond to that?
You know, it's interesting. I think the rules are made by the legislative body that's charged with making the rules. I mean, whether it be Congress or whether it be the FCC or whether it be state legislatures or state public service commissions, you have to have some standardization. You cannot have railroads in which the rails are different widths at the state line as we used to have at one point. So there have to be some rules of that nature. But I think we also need to recognize something that is whether we agree with it or not, is a fact of American life. And that is in 1978, the U.S. Supreme Court said that corporations, as artificial persons, have the right to speak under the First Amendment. The same right to speak that you and I, as natural persons, have under the First Amendment. So to somehow attempt to make the argument that, wait a minute, we should stop them from acting the way they would ordinarily act because corporations' aim is to make money, to sell more product, to gain more customers, I think we need to be careful, and it may be that we're trying to advocate overturning the law of the land and let's go some other direction, in which case, great, it's 30 years old, needs to be thrown out anyway. But on the other hand, maybe not.
In response to the last couple of things and addressed to the panel, especially, I guess it's Mr. Lisby, but the question of, is there a conflict between profiting and freedom of journalism? I think that the last question, there was some assumption that those are at odds, that making money and freely expressing yourself are automatically in conflict. And also kind of back to the idea of a CEO having a ghostwriter, that assumption that the honesty of the CEO or the freedom of that person to express him or herself is at odds with anything other than just pure and honest, open expression of his or her heart. I'm just wondering kind of what the thoughts are of that, if that really is the consensus or if there's some overlap there.
Well, the purest form of expression has, to my mind, be the political protest because it usually is individual, it usually is heartfelt, it usually is someone who's willing to take a stand against incredible odds to the contrary. And yet, by and large, almost without exception, every other type of speech is economic, has an economic basis. I'm reminded that when I became an attorney, my sister-in-law told me that I had better not try to charge her for my legal advice. And, you know, that's the interesting thing, but what is it that I have to sell if it's not my advice based on my expertise? What does a journalist have to sell if it is not the information, the understanding, the contextual perspective that he or she has gathered based upon the research he's done?
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. When I first got into journalism, it stated a very noble ambition to write about the truth and make sure I delivered that to my audience. But the further I got into it, I realized when I saw the cost of printing, I saw the costs of labor and the cost of space, and I realized, wow, this is a business. I guess there is going to be a need for like advertising and things. You learn over time that there is a cost to doing business, and yeah, I mean that's the fun part about the newsroom, that natural conflict that exists between the business and the newsroom. That's part of the fun of it, and it's going to exist within the blogosphere too. Over time, that's going to start to evolve more. You're going to have the content providers versus the business people. and they're going to come into conflict at times, and there's going to have to be resolution, and there are going to be fights in the hallways like we used to have. And that's part of what journalism's all about.
Well, the rest of the story about Josh Marshall, who won the Journalism Award and was written up in the New York Times, is that he now has a fairly large staff. And he sells advertising on his site, and he also accepts donations. I think he began just taking donations from people that wanted to support his work, but he now sells advertising. And I would argue that it's virtually impossible not to face some conflict when you start accepting advertising, just as you do in any newsroom, because there's some sense of pressure that's going to be there when it comes time to write honestly about someone that's supporting your livelihood. And I think that's going to be one of those ethical issues that bloggers have to learn to navigate well. Otherwise, they can easily get compromised. And not only that, we've seen some of the compromises happen already where corporations have, in fact, gone through public relations agencies and offered payment to bloggers to write positive stories about their companies. And we've found that there actually are bloggers out there who are all too willing to accept the money and do so. So we know that money does tend to influence communication. In some cases, can actually have the effect of corrupting communication. And news media traditionally have had to deal with that for a long time, hence the sort of Chinese wall between advertising and the newsroom that people try to keep in place as best they can.
I just have a question, something I'd like to say to Professor Lisby there. You talked about corporation as individuals, in fact, as expression and all, but let's not kid ourselves. The corporations are doing a lot when it comes to sort of net neutrality, to have a bigger voice than the individual has. They're doing a lot in the areas of copyright law. And so these are not just another Joe on the street, trying to have self-expression. They're working in their special interest. And I think the rest of us have to recognize that and work in our own interest as much as we can.
I would agree 100%. If I may borrow a line from Pink Floyd, money talks.
Why don't we take one more? And I know the folks would be glad to probably stay around a little bit and chat with some of you if you'd like to do that one-on-one. But I want to be respectful of your time, and I think if we take one more, we'll get out of here comfortably before 8 o'clock, and we will have done pretty well. I hate to cut it off. Who has one more question or comment?
Well, I wanted to, those of us who have online businesses, what are you seeing in the trends? When you write your point of view blog, how do you navigate the business needs versus the editorial? And for the AJC, do you guys write, to create a little more criticize and say, wow, you wrote 5 stories about a new mall, now we see, full-page spreads about the new mall, and that's driving your editorial. And so what are you guys seeing in terms of on the web advertising and how it deals with editorial?
I would just offer this, and it gets back to the woman's question over here before, as well as your question, as well as the question that was raised earlier, which I think is an excellent one. I think tension, we're essentially talking about conflict and tension. If we get back to kind of the original point of news and news gathering and sharing information, I think this tension that we're describing creates creativity. And I think you've been creative in forming your own online business, and you're going to manage and make decisions based on what that business is going to produce for you. You're going to have ethical challenges. You're going to have to maybe turn away an advertiser or two. In my case, I haven't accepted any advertising yet. It's just simply haven't. Doesn't mean I won't. But I think, it gets back into who's your audience, who are you really selling, marketing, communicating to, and do they believe and trust what you're bringing? If you preserve that, everything else is secondary. And I don't mean to underemphasize the need to make a profit on a website. It's a brutal challenge. But at the same time, just keep in mind that tension, right? The tension's good. It's not always bad.
Any other response to that? Well, let's end on that note. I want to thank the panel again and ask you to join me in thanking them.